We're going to look at Lady Macbeth at the end of the play, so in Acts 3 and 5. The first thing we need to look at is the banquet scene, which is such an important scene. It's pivotal in many ways. It's kind of like a coronation banquet, really, because it's the first time since Macbeth has become king that they've invited all the noblemen to the castle. So it's meant to really be symbolic of their new reign, and so it's meant to be a celebration. It's meant to be ordered. It's meant to be a mark of their status. And yet actually what happens is lots of disorder. So the moment Banquo's ghost arrives, it's unclear whether it's a hallucination or whether it's genuinely there, but Macbeth can see it and is very disturbed by it, understandably. He starts speaking to the ghost. No one else obviously can see the ghost, and so they don't know what he's talking about, but they can see that he's very disturbed. He starts talking about blood, and Lady Macbeth tries to maintain some order. She tries to bring him back to reality, and tries to get him to snap out of it, basically. And she does that using various techniques. So she tries insulting his manhood. She says, "Are you a man?" She mocks him. She says, "This is just like a woman's story at a winter's fire, authorized by her grandam." And she's trying to use very similar techniques to the techniques that she used back in Act 1, Scene 7, but they're no longer effective. Perhaps that suggests that her ability to influence him has shrunk. She's desperate, though. She tries everything. She even tries flattery. She calls him "my worthy lord." She warns him of the danger of exposing himself and revealing his true thoughts to the noblemen when she says, "Your noble friends do lack you." She tries everything to try to snap him back to reality and to stop him from humiliating himself and her. But ultimately, her attempts to maintain that sense of order fail. She, in many ways, is the stronger one in this situation at this point, because she's trying to hold things together. She's not the one who's ranting and seeing ghosts. She's trying to pull it all back together and create a sense of order and control. Trying to put on a respectable image and provide excuses for her husband. So she's still the strong one at this stage, but she fails to maintain that sense of order, and she never really recovers from this. By the end of the scene, when we see, so the noblemen have gone, and we see Macbeth and Lady Macbeth together, Shakespeare, I think, really contrasts the two characters. So Lady Macbeth at this point provides very short, clipped responses to what Macbeth is saying. If you look at the very end of Act 3, Scene 4, she just says the odd line, the odd short answer to his questions. How is she feeling at this point? Well, perhaps this could suggest that she's exhausted, that she's humiliated, that she's angry at her husband's behavior in front of everyone. Maybe she's certainly going to be disappointed. A mixture of all those things, but she barely speaks. And that's such a contrast, if you think about it, to Act 1, Scene 7, when she was persuading him to go ahead with the murder, when she was so dominant, wasn't she, in her dialogue with her husband. At that point, she would barely let him speak, whereas now, she's barely saying anything herself. It's as if they've reversed roles to some extent, in that Macbeth is now totally focused on killing. He's saying things such as "blood will have blood." He wants to go ahead and kill everyone who is a threat to him. He is increasingly worried about Macduff, and so he's planning to go and kill Macduff's wife and children. And he doesn't need any motivation from Lady Macbeth at this point. And so Lady Macbeth becomes an increasingly isolated figure. From this point on, we don't see Macbeth and Lady Macbeth together. And I think that's Shakespeare highlighting the contrast between them. She, from this moment onwards, starts to descend into insanity. This is the beginning of her downfall. I suppose maybe because she's tried to put on a front and to hold things together and maintain a sense of order, and yet she's failed. And she no longer really has a role in her marriage either, because they seem to be drifting in different directions. What you need to do then is contrast the way that Lady Macbeth is presented at the end of the play to the way that she was presented at the beginning. At the beginning, She's this very astute, dominant, manipulative, independent, strong woman. But how has she changed? Well, the key scene to look here is Act 5, Scene 1, where we see the doctor and the gentlewoman talking about Lady Macbeth, and the way that she's been behaving. And then she comes along and starts speaking in her sleep, saying, "Out, damned spot, out." The gentlewoman says of Lady Macbeth that she will rise from her bed, throw her nightgown upon her, unlock her closet, take forth paper, fold it, write upon it, read it, afterwards seal it, and return to bed. And it could be interesting and important here that she seemed to be writing a letter, in that Shakespeare could be using a technique called mirroring here. Mirroring is when you have the same or a very similar setting or scene at 2 points, but you use it to highlight what's changed. You use it to highlight the differences. And of course, at the beginning of the play, she was reading a letter from Macbeth. Now she's writing a letter, maybe to him, maybe to God, maybe it's a letter of confession of some sort. But through using the same activity, in effect, or a very similar one, I think what it highlights is how much has changed. By this point, we see a Lady Macbeth who is racked with guilt, don't we? Who, as the doctor says, is more in need of the divine than the physician. And perhaps this desire to confess could suggest a conscience, a sign of humanity, rather than a fiend-like nature. So in terms of how we respond to her, her moments of weakness during this scene, I think, could shift the way that you respond to her as a member of the audience. Certainly a Jacobean audience would have felt nothing but shock and horror and revulsion at the way that she asked to be possessed by evil spirits and rejected her, sort of traditional feminine norms and characteristics at the beginning of the play. But now, how do you respond to her? Is it sympathy? Is it pity? There's certainly a sense of the appreciation that she has found herself, albeit as the result of her own actions. She's found herself in a position where she is struggling to cope emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. We're told that she carries a candle around with her, and it says, "How came she by that light?" And we're told apparently she has light by her continually, 'tis her command. So that this suggests that she's no longer comfortable with darkness, and that she's seeking to be closer to God, to goodness, to the Holy Spirit, which is what the light could represent. Contrast that to her saying at the beginning of the play, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty." There she was very much embracing darkness, whereas now she's fearing it, she's rejecting it, she's trying to seek the light. She's found herself in a dark hole of sin and guilt, and she's desperately trying to claw herself out of it. What we see is physical and psychological afflictions that are caused by her guilt and by the corruption of evil. We're told that her eyes are open, but their senses shut. Look how she rubs her hands. And she says, "These hands will ne'er be clean. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." What we're seeing there in terms of the way that she's behaving physically, by rubbing her hands, the idea of her eyes being open, but her apparently not seeing anything, this idea of her wanting to wash her hands and not be able to get the blood off. These are the physical and psychological consequences of her actions. At one point in Act 5, Scene 1, the doctor says, "Unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles." And so to a Jacobean audience, what this would be highlighting was that this is what happens to people who disobey God. This is what happens to people who disturb the great chain of being, who commit an act so unnatural as regicide. But on the other hand, her human frailty and her vulnerability are displayed in this scene through her guilt-ridden mind. And so, as a member of the audience, perhaps Shakespeare is steering us towards looking at her more as a human being rather than purely some demonic entity that we can dismiss as evil and not even try to empathize with or to consider in a human light in any way. So perhaps it's steering us towards at least focusing on that fragility and that vulnerability as we get towards the end of the play.